Coming up in this episode, we're going to begin our look at platform games and try to understand how they evolved into the concept we know and love today. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your Great Game Guide. Get ready for our look at many of the great platform games you may have played, may have heard of, or may have missed. I'm going to start with a simple question. What is a platform game? Because when I was growing up as a young gamer in the 1980s, the term platformer wasn't in common use, at least not right away. The term appears to have originated in the UK, and according to a well-researched piece on Medium by Davey R. Howard, the earliest mention is probably from the debut issue of Crash magazine in February of 1984, where it's used to describe the genre of Kong games in the mold of Donkey Kong or Manic Miner, where players move between platforms suspended in empty space by either jumping or using ladders. Before we get too excited, that same issue concocted a bunch of other subgenres like ghost gobbling and creepy crawlies that weren't nearly as prescient, and it took a while for the platform games moniker to catch on as well. You didn't see it used very commonly in the UK magazines until later in the 1980s. I don't think I came across the term platform game myself until probably the mid-1990s when the genre was in decline, and I at first assumed it was referring to another use of the word platform, the console systems themselves. Since platform games were at that point heavily associated with mascots and with being exclusive to various platforms. Nintendo had Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong Country, Sega had Alex Kidd and Miracle World and Sonic the Hedgehog, the TurboGrafx-16 had Bonk's Adventure, the PlayStation had Crash Bandicoot, and the 3DO, at least initially, had Gex. So it wasn't too much of a stretch to presume that the idea of a platformer was to represent a console platform, and that the other games that were in the same vein earned the title because of what they were imitating. In fact, when you look at the gaming magazines of the 1980s and 90s, and since I grew up in the US, those would have been magazines like Nintendo Power, GamePro, EGM, and Die Hard Game Fan, what you often see these games referred to runs the gamut of terms like action games, jumping games, climbing games, hop and bop games, or simply some reference to the game they most resemble. Donkey Kong, Super Mario Bros., or Sonic the Hedgehog being some of the most popular comparisons for pure platformers, and Mega Man, Metroid, Castlevania, Zelda 2 Link's Adventure, and Contra being common points of comparison for more action-focused games. Shigeru Miyamoto himself referred to the genre he pretty much created as being a jump game, and this makes sense given the fact that all of the Mario games, going back to Donkey Kong itself, are largely about using Mario's jumping abilities to progress. Super Mario Bros. Obviously tuned up Mario's stiff and predictable jump from his earlier outings so that Mario had a stronger sense of vertical reach, momentum, and control wherever he was in the air, but every mainline Mario game, all the way up to Odyssey and Wonder, is built around jumps. And even the Mario sports games and party games and RPGs and tactical strategy games and other offshoots tend to allow Mario to hop around at the very least if he's a playable character. Of course, we shouldn't assume things had to be this way. Mario evolved as a character and a concept because that's what made sense at the time. It's interesting to think that if Miyamoto had given the go-ahead to make his planned Popeye game first, that platform games might have involved a lot more of a combat focus from the get-go. The basic ideas behind platform games were probably inevitable to some degree, but their distinctive emphasis on running and jumping instead of shooting and stabbing was not a foregone conclusion. In the 1980s and 90s, the terms we use for games today weren't in any way solidified, and many of the more established formats we now recognize arose from either marketing terminology trying to describe games that were going to be available for sale, or from the enthusiast gaming press trying to describe games that they were previewing or reviewing. Describing something new to someone is much easier if you can evoke a sense of the comparable qualities it has to something else. If you describe Galaga as Space Invaders but in space and without shields, that's a pretty good explanation of the gameplay if you're already familiar with Space Invaders. If you describe Dig Dug as Pac-Man but with underground digging, the description misses a lot of the distinctive qualities of Dig Dug and also ignores the fact that you progress by killing enemies, not munching dots, but it's still a decent enough way of describing a game where you move up, down, left, or right in a grid-like world that has the qualities of a maze. And if you describe Super Pitfall as being Super Mario Bros. But way less polished, you don't even need to explain the connection to previous Pitfall games or how the game takes place in a giant cavern instead of interconnected levels. You've captured the essential mechanics of the game as well as the quality, and that's all most people would need to know in order to decide if they want to give it a try. This is one of the reasons why so many of the early descriptions for action games tended to center on the mechanics of what you're doing. We have maze chase games, we have run and gun games, and hack and slash games, and beat 'em up games, and fighting games. Scrolling shooters would later receive shoot 'em up and cute 'em up monikers to differentiate them from the shooting gallery games, and the far more popular Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake-style 3D shooting games, which would eventually become known as first-person shooters once people got tired of comparing every new 3D shooter to one of id Software's standards. Platform games are a little different from other action games in that they tend to be defined not by what you do, but by what you see. And in the 1980s and 90s, comparing single-screen platformers like Donkey Kong, Space Panic, or Bubble Bobble to a scrolling screen platformer like Super Mario Bros. Or Disney's DuckTales would have seemed to be a little bit of a stretch because those sorts of games felt so different, not just mechanically, but also in terms of theme. The simpler games had a very basic story and were largely about clearing screens to progress, but the more complex scrolling titles had worlds to explore, hidden passages to locate, a wider range of actions available, and a more compelling adventure to offer. And that word, adventure, is a really important idea because at the heart, platformers almost always have a theme or a storyline that's guiding you along. You can play a game like Pac-Man or Dig Dug or Rally X and never really need to know why you're doing any of the things that you're doing. Even scrolling shooters in the mold of Scramble or River Raid tended to only have the most basic of justifications for why you needed to destroy your enemies. But if it's Donkey Kong, you're Mario the Carpenter trying to make your way through a construction site to save Pauline from an escaped gorilla. If it's Super Mario Bros., you're Mario the Plumber traversing the Mushroom Kingdom to save the princess from the evil King of the Koopas. And if it's Donkey Kong Country, you're Donkey Kong and his friend Diddy Kong trying to reclaim a banana stash from the villainous King K. Rool and his army of Kremlings. This is one of the three hallmarks of a platform game: storytelling. But unlike the adventure games we just spent weeks and weeks talking about, platformers traditionally didn't use much in-game speech or text to explain what was happening. The story of these 1980s and early 90s games would unfold as you played through the game via visual cues, background occurrences, and occasional quick cutscenes. And whether you were Sonic the Hedgehog running towards the increasingly mechanical region where Dr. Robotnik's lair could be found, Sparkster the Rocket Knight blasting off towards the Devo Tendos Empire to rescue Princess Sherry and stop the rise of the Pigstar, Bubsy the sarcastic cat setting up to stop the Woolies from stealing all the Earth's yarn balls, or Kirby the Cream Puff traversing Dreamland to retrieve the stars and food stolen by evil mallet-wielding Bluebird King DDD, you always had some idea of what you were trying to accomplish. Even in simpler games like Bubble Bobble or the New Zealand story, there was a setup, an unfolding storyline, and an ending. And this carried over to many other platform-style action games as well, which is why games like Mega Man, Kid Icarus, Castlevania, Contra, and Metroid all told their stories through visuals and big moments, rather than through lengthy dialogue exchanges or cutscenes like you'd see in later action platformers, as those genres grew more sophisticated. Beyond storytelling, a second hallmark of platform games is the insistence on obeying some notion of physics. Physics mainly manifest in four ways: gravity, timing, momentum, and collision detection. Gravity was not a new concept introduced by platform games, but it was a chief idea of them. In many games prior to 1980, players controlled characters from an overhead, chase cam, or first-person perspective so that they could move freely along the X and Y axis on a single screen. This made a lot of sense because many early video games were based on the same principles as electromechanical games. And even the earliest console, the Magnavox Odyssey, had games based around X and Y axis manipulations. And games that utilized the diorama-like side perspective tended to either have you utilizing gravity as a core mechanic, landing your lunar craft, dropping bombs, working your way through the ocean depths, or so forth, or ignored it entirely by giving you the ability to fly. But platform games changed this notion. If your character was restricted to moving along the X-axis freely, and then could only manipulate the Y-axis by ascending or descending ladders or with jumps or drops, the gameplay both became more limiting, but also more interesting because the player couldn't just push up to avoid enemies or hazards. They had to time jumps or make proper use of ladders to stay out of harm's way. By setting the bottom of the screen as the floor and the top of the screen as the ceiling, the platforms themselves could serve as places where players could travel between the two extremes. Some platformers started to add variations to this formula. Some included platforms that could initially hold the character but crumble and drop to the bottom of the screen. Others offered one-way platforms that could be jumped onto from below but not traveled back through to head back down. And still others offered platforms that could become hazards by popping up spikes or dropping like trapdoors to send the player downward. These variations all led to teaching players to time their movements and jumps carefully to successfully navigate stages. Collision detection, already in use in a number of games for causing the player to perish when connecting to enemies, bullets, and hazards, added another wrinkle to platforming because it allowed the games to create barriers that could only be overcome with jumps, and also higher floors or lower ceilings that could be used to create maze-like sections on the limited screen real estate available. Momentum was also tremendously important in platform games because most did not allow the player to jump forward or backwards in a parabolic arc unless he or she was already moving. Jump from a standstill, and most platformers would simply have you leap straight up with no change in your x-axis position. You had to be in motion to get the jump to move in that direction. Some later platform games also added in the idea of speed as a modifier for jump distances. If you were walking, running, or rocketing your way through a stage, the arc of your jump would change accordingly, potentially widening or shortening your ability to travel across pits or hazards. Many platform games also use this element of momentum to add in special terrain that can make a player's momentum decrease faster and limit their speed, often represented by sand or vegetation or water or goop, or which made the surfaces less likely to slow players down, resulting in the dreaded ice levels. But beyond storytelling and physics, platform games have a third hallmark: one or more well-defined objectives that go beyond simply trying to score more points. And these can be broken down into 5 categories. The first objective is collection, which involves picking up all of something so that the screen or level can be cleared and you can move on to the next stage. In Mappy, for example, you have to retrieve all of the stolen items from Goro and the thieving Meowki cats. The second objective is enemy elimination, which involves getting rid of all of the enemies on screen. In Bubble Bobble, you can't move on to the second stage until you clear out all the enemies on the first. The third objective is rescue, which involves reaching characters who will not harm you and potentially bringing them back to a safe place. In Hero, your helicopter backpack-wearing character has to reach the trapped miners. And in Flicky, your mama bird must rescue her young and get them to the door to the next level. The fourth objective is survival, which involves getting through a level or screen without dying or losing all your lives. In Jungle King, also known as Jungle Hunt, you must face a number of challenges in different levels, like swinging on vines, swimming with crocodiles, jumping over boulders, and dodging hungry cannibals, and get past each scenario through skillful play. The fifth objective is speed, which involves getting through a level or screen within a set time limit. This is rarely the main objective of platformers because, quite honestly, it's not very much fun unless the game offers generous conditions or unlimited attempts. Where you see it most often prior to modern platformers is in bonus stages or as a hurry-up mechanism used to keep players from lingering on one stage for too long. Prior to Super Mario Bros., you'd often find platform games with definitely 1, probably 2, or maybe even 3 of these objectives, but rarely with all 5 of them. But once Shigeru Miyamoto and his team at Nintendo R&D 4 broke the mold with a seminal game, all 5 objectives became so standard that it was rare to see a platformer without them. And that's useful, because it means in our discussion of platformers we have a few eras we can break things down into. The first era was the early days when Space Panic, Donkey Kong, Pitfall, and other games like them were laying the foundations for the genre. The second era begins with Pac-Land, Kung Fu Master, and Super Mario Bros., and introduce players to scrolling stages, more complex mechanics, and the eventual fusion of everything we just discussed. The third era began with attempts to move platformers into 3 dimensions, with a lot of missteps along the way before we got games like Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro the Dragon, Sonic Adventure, and Crash Bandicoot. The fourth era began with the revival of the 2D platformer on handheld devices like the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, Neo Geo Pocket Color, and the PSP. The fifth era began with the rise of indie and small studio gaming and digital distribution. And the sixth era began with the maturity of these small studio games into major releases in their own right, like Hollow Knight Silksong, Cuphead, Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, A Hat in Time, and The Plucky Squire. And that's the era we're in today. And so we're going to cover all of that in this series of the Great Game Guide. But before we can get started, we need to understand why these games evolved in the first place. And that means going back to the 1970s when video gaming was still such a new idea that no one had figured any of these things out yet. So what's important to remember about the 1970s is that video gaming was new, it was limited, and it was fairly rare. By which I mean that even the extremely popular Atari VCS, also known as the Atari 2600, had only sold 8 million consoles by 1980. Most of the best games required expensive dedicated hardware to run, which meant they were better suited to arcades than to homes, and the personal computer market hadn't really even taken off yet. I also want to emphasize that home electronics were still a pretty serious investment at that time, and people weren't nearly as eager to rush out and buy the latest, greatest thing in the 1970s, especially since there was a major recession in the Western world from 1973 to 1975 that had aftershocks for many years. Just to put things in perspective, I grew up in the 1980s, and I remember going to older people's houses, and they'd have a black and white TV in their living room because it still worked, and they didn't see any need for upgrading to color, and color TVs had been around for over 20 years at that point. So, the market for home video games was pretty limited to the sorts of people who had the disposable income required to be early adopters for new home electronics. And that meant that the consumer-grade hardware had to be pretty inexpensive for people to even consider it. This was a problem because creating a new console required an expensive R&D process and also required finding an inexpensive enough chipset to run the software. And with electronics advancing rapidly and competitors feeling unafraid to put out shoddy copycats of dedicated machines, video game makers needed a good solution to break out of making endless Pong clones, the novelty of which had already worn off on many consumers. One of the big innovations after the Pong fad wore off was the Fairchild Channel F's interchangeable cartridges, which were created by Jerry Lawson, an African-American electrical engineer who was one of the great pioneers of video game hardware. Though the Channel F was not a popular console, Lawson was part of the broader Silicon Valley electronics scene that included Atari, and it's unsurprising that Atari was also pursuing interchangeable ROM cartridges and used them for the VCS as well. After all, Atari hired several people who'd worked at Fairchild to consult on their own hardware. Atari's VCS was successful because it was a good piece of hardware, but also because it was backed by Atari's considerable reputation as a maker of arcade games. And for the first several years of the VCS's existence, a lot of the games on the platform were either home versions of their arcade games or sports games. Even so, aside from maybe Breakout, Combat, Indy 500, Skydiver, and maybe Superman, I really wouldn't recommend any of the VCS games from the 1970s. They're really, pretty awful by today's standards. But it was games like Skydiver and Superman, also Basketball, Air Sea Battle, Canyon Bomber, and Human Cannonball, that helped to at least explore the potential for action games that were depicted from a side view perspective, instead of a top-down one like Indy 500 or Combat, or Atari's arcade hit Asteroids. And of course, Tato's Space Invaders, which followed the Breakout style of scrolling a turret along the X-axis across the bottom of the screen while shooting upwards, helped to further cement the idea of seeing the action from the side and treating the ground at the bottom as the origin of the action. Let's pause for a moment and talk about something else you'd see in arcades at the time, and that was electromechanical games. Williams made one in 1970 called Flotilla, where a belt with 3D buildings would scroll on a treadmill to give you the illusion of movement, and you'd fire cannons and try to hit the structures. It's really neat to see it in action. Sega had a pretty amazing one in 1977 called Helishooter that allowed you to fly a helicopter over a projected 3D model of an island and blast buildings for points. It's an amazingly clever way of delivering an analog game experience, and I wish we had more cool creations like that today. There were other really neat electromechanical games as well. A Japanese arcade company called Casco also used 3D holographic technology to create the shooting gallery games Gunsmoke, Ninja Gun, and Bank Robber, which were all basically like the great-grandfather to first-person shooters. And Casco made this truly amazing 3D space bombardment game called Star 5 that had a model of a planet inside the cabinet and projected a starship on top of it. You had to dive bomb red light sensors and hit them precisely to score points. A lot of electromechanical games had a depth of field that was best suited to first-person play, but there were also some fascinating ones in which you'd have a third-person view. One of those was the 1971 Midway game called Stunt Plane, where you had to fly a circular pattern to get your plane through an arch. Sega made a neat one in 1973 called Moto Champ, where you steered a toy motorcycle rider down a road, racing with 4 other toys on the track. and Sega's 1969 shooting game Gunfight was truly amazing. You and your opponent would each control a gunfighter toy on either side of an Old West shooting arena, and you moved your toy as you tried to hit the other one with your gunshot. The game even allowed you to shoot cactuses between the two fighters and knock their tops over. All of this context helps us to understand how arcade games were evolving during the 1970s. Electromechanical games could offer very sophisticated experiences that video games would struggle to catch up to for quite a while, but they were expensive to build and to operate, and they broke down frequently due to all the moving parts. Coin-operated video games had many more limitations in terms of graphics and engaging gameplay, but they were also far more scalable, easier to build, easier to fix, more durable, and potentially smaller in overall size. A lot of the philosophy of coin-operated video games arose from what worked for electromechanical games. If you restricted the degrees of freedom in a game and focused on providing a simple, accessible experience, you could impress people enough to get them to surrender the quarters in their pockets. And yet, at the same time, video games needed to offer something truly novel beyond their ability to do things like display high score tables or integrate digital sound effects, or they'd just be seen as an inferior copy of technology that already existed in a different form. So, for example, when Nintendo decided to ship a pretty lousy arcade game called Radar Scope, it didn't impress anyone because it felt too much like a Space Invaders style video game embedded in the deep playfield of an electromechanical game. It's not hard to understand why Nintendo would have tried to pair those two styles. They'd been mildly successful with Sheriff, known in North America as Bandito, which was a video game take on the Wild West concept of their earlier electromechanical shooter Wild Gunman. Nintendo had long had a peculiar philosophy of trying to integrate the old along with the new, and Radar Scope was just that. It's actually interesting that people will look backwards at the game today and describe it as being unique without recognizing that it felt like a clunker to arcade audiences when it released in 1980. What can I say? Nintendo's popularity today tends to cloud memories and prompt reinterpretation of some of the Big N's biggest blunders. And Radar Scope was a big blunder. I'm sorry, Nintendo fans, but it is a bad game. Play it today and see for yourself if you don't believe me. It's repetitive, and it's boring, and it plays like a simple shooting gallery game designed to suck down your quarters. Half the enemies sit outside your cannon's range, and you don't even have any cover or tactical countermeasures to avoid them when they start flying towards you. It did offer some digitized speech and tried to look 3D in its cabinet and cockpit formats by tilting its monitor and reflecting the image on the glass pane between the screen and the player, but it's a lousy effect. Nintendo bet big on this cabinet and wound up with 2,000 of them on its hands, completely unsold. As you can read in the book Game Over by David Sheff, which is the authoritative source on all things early Nintendo, Nintendo had to figure out a pivot with a conversion kit and promoted the young artist Shigeru Miyamoto, who'd previously done some of the artwork or cabinet art for Radar Scope, his contributions aren't exactly known, to design a conversion kit for the game. The result was Donkey Kong, and unlike Radar Scope, it didn't feel like a game that was looking backwards. In fact, aside from Universal Space Panic, released the year before, there really wasn't anything like it. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Donkey Kong because it's extremely well-trod territory at this point. Play it if you haven't played it already, but I can't imagine that you haven't because it's one of the most ubiquitous classic video games of all time. Working with Gunpei Yokoi, Miyamoto designed a game based on many ideas borrowed from Western stories such as King Kong, Popeye, Macbeth, and Beauty and the Beast, and reused Sheriff's damsel in distress focus to create something where an everyday hero could ascend a construction site and save a girl from an angry gorilla. The hero went through different names like Commander Video and Jumpman before eventually earning the moniker of Mario, possibly based on the name of the Italian-American landlord for Nintendo of America's headquarters, Mario Segale. The girl, originally called the Lady, got the name Pauline after the girlfriend of the warehouse manager. The ape got the name Donkey Kong due to a peculiar understanding of what those words mean in English. The artwork and conversion kits were shipped to Seattle, where Nintendo's small team, including the son-in-law of Nintendo's powerful CEO back in Japan, got to work converting cabinets and soon found great success, saving the arcade division. But those details are all superficial to our discussion. What Donkey Kong did well was solidify the basic hallmarks I talked about earlier: storytelling, physics, and well-defined objectives, with a focus on survival and rescue and a minor focus on accruing points to achieve a high score. It's one of the earliest platformers to integrate the idea of a power-up in the hammer, and it's also one of the earliest platformers to alternate what happens on each screen before repeating. It is, without question, the game that popularized all of these elements, and it was such a hot commodity for home consoles that Coleco snatched up the rights and used it to boost their ColecoVision, famously releasing an inferior version for the Atari 2600 while offering a very strong arcade port on their own system. It also inspired a huge wave of games that adapted or outright copied its formula, including Jumpman and Jumpman Jr., Miner 2049er, Manic Miner, Chucky Egg, Hard Hat Mac, Beauty and the Beast, Kong, King Kong, Donkey King, Killer Kong, and Crazy Kong, just to name a few. We'll take a detailed look at those next week and the week after to see how they help to further evolve the platformer genre. But there's one other game we need to discuss, and it's one you've probably heard of. I've mentioned it several times in this episode already, in fact, but also probably never played. And that game is Space Panic. In 1979, a team of students in the Theoretical Science Group at the University of Tokyo created a very unusual game called Heian-kyo Alien, set in the Heian era of what's now Kyoto, and tasking a police officer with digging holes to trap invading alien monsters and then to cover them back up before they could escape. The game was created in response to a general challenge for Japanese computer programmers to create the next Space Invaders, and while Heian-kyo Alien would prove to be very influential over time, it would never reach that level of success. In fact, the only official commercial versions to ever make it out of Japan were an arcade localization from Sega Gremlin called Digger in 1980 and a Game Boy port in 1990 under the original name. Heian-kyo Alien is not a side-scrolling game. It's actually an overhead game similar to Pac-Man, set in the maze-like streets of the city. But its chief innovation, laying traps, inspired a company called Universal to adapt the concept into 1980's Space Panic, a game with a sort of chutes and ladders side view conceit where the player had to walk on platforms connected by ladders and then dig holes and trick pursuing aliens into falling into them. To add to this enemy elimination mechanic, players also had limited oxygen to ensure they try to maximize their speed and not just sit on a single space between two traps. To add to their mobility, players could also jump through holes to escape aliens, landing on the platform below, and then having to climb back up to try to close the holes before the aliens escaped. Space Panic feels very basic and dull today, mainly because this set of mechanics was copied and reused by a lot of games, from outright clones like Apple Panic, Alien Panic, Frenzy, and Panic, to semi-clones like Lode Runner, to Universal's own clone, Mr. Do's Castle, to somewhat different games like Mappy or Burger Time. But all of these games utilize the same hallmarks of a platformer, a somewhat thin rationale for why you need to panic, physics that connect you to the platform floors and make you or the enemies move downwards as they're dropped, and clearly defined objectives. Space Panic predates Donkey Kong by nearly a year, and it's often listed in video game resources as the first true platform game. It's possible there was something that came before it. You'd be surprised how many obscure hobby concepts there were during that era on mainframe computers and microcomputers, but it's definitely the first known commercial platform game, and certainly one of the most influential despite being relatively obscure thanks to being overshadowed by later games like Lode Runner. One thing I find particularly fascinating about Space Panic is that it lacks a jump button, which suggests that Donkey Kong's biggest contribution to the genre may be the inclusion of that mechanic. Today, it's hard to imagine a platform game without running and jumping, but Space Panic and the games that followed in its wake instead used ladders and stairs to allow for vertical movement, and this allowed for a couple of interesting ideas. First, enemies could also use those ladders, and you of course see enemies doing that in Donkey Kong as well, but second, the ladders tended to add a variable speed to the player's choice of movement by being slower than simply walking around, and definitely slower than falling through a hole. And yet, at the same time, ladders could allow players more control over their response to enemies. They created a risk-reward mechanic that running and jumping didn't, and it's interesting that ladders started disappearing from pure platformers once Super Mario Bros. Caught on, but remained in action platformers as a necessary way to travel between vertical parts of the level. But we'll get to that, and so much more as we continue on with this series looking at platform games in depth. Next week, we're going to talk about how the platformer genre started to solidify and evolve with some of the aforementioned copycat games and offshoots, as well as with other seminal titles like Pitfall, Jungle King, Montezuma's Revenge, and more. And in the coming weeks, we'll work our way towards Super Mario Bros., and then onto the topics of mascot platformers, the awkward transition into 3D, and the later eras of platform gaming. As always, I'll dive deep into talking about games you might not know as well, and we'll touch on a few you ought to check out. It's gonna be a fun series, and I hope you're looking forward to seeing where this discussion will take us. If you enjoy this show, you can read this series every week on my Substack at greatestgames.substack.com, where you'll also find brand new articles on other great games you've probably never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on Bluesky. I'm Sean Jordan. I am your great game guide, and I'll be back next week with more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I'm recommending Sorry We're Closed, a really wild 2024 survival horror adventure game from A La Mode Games and Akapara Games that's sort of like a combination between Silent Hill, Metaphor ReFantasio, and Andy Warhol's pop art. I want to state up front that this isn't normally my kind of game, and I do have a couple of gripes that I'll share in a moment, but it's really well made, smartly written, and full of interesting surprises, and amazingly stylish for a game set in what seems to be the most cursed corner of Britain. The premise of the game is that you're a convenience store clerk named Michelle who has a weird dream one night about a demon sneaking into your room and bestowing you with a third eye to see the spiritual world. But this gift is also a curse because you can't find a way to break free of it. You're going to become the demon's newest plaything. Fortunately, there are angels and demons all around you, and with your newfound powers, you can see them. Unfortunately, you also have to fight some of them, and that's where the game does fall short a bit, because it's about as clunky as Silent Hill, by which I mean the original one, when it comes to fighting things. The most frustrating points of the game are the boss battles, which often require a lot of trial and error and make a pretty strong argument for playing the game on its easiest mode so you can just enjoy the story. And the story is good, exploring the topics of love and holding on to people and broken hearts and how angels can fall and demons can be redeemed. It's also pretty notable for its LGBTQ+ themes and non-binary characters. It's all depicted in a lo-fi, low-polygon style that sort of resembles the late 1990s chunky 3D graphics, but it also has a strong sense of style and great art design, though I will say, it's definitely not for children. Be sure to give this one a try, at least if you're 18 or older. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, Bluesky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!